Sony just announced the A7S Mark III.
Oh yeah? Where'd you hear that?
They just posted it. Sony Alpha Rumors. It's got 4K 60, 10-bit, 24 megapixels. This thing looks crazy. It comes out in 2 weeks.
Yeah, but I really like our cameras, and will our clients even notice if we change? I mean, it doesn't even sound that different from the one we already have.
Whoa, the A7S Mark III. Wow, let me try this thing out. No way. 8K, dude. 8K. This is better than the R5. Whoa, my shots are gonna be so good, dude. This is the best camera ever.
Yo, dude, get up.
Oh, it was April Fool's. I need to stop reading camera rumors. What's up, guys? So obviously you know I'm very brand loyal to Sony products, and we have been throughout our whole career. We started out with the A6500, then upgraded to the A7 III, and now we have this Sony Fx9. I absolutely adore this camera, and I know a lot of you guys were curious about my thoughts on the Fx9 compared to the A7 III, why I decided to upgrade, and I want to provide you guys with all the context, my whole thought process on what I think of the two cameras and where the Fx9 shines and the A7 III just doesn't quite do it for me anymore. So let's get right into it. So like I said, this video is going to be more about the context of why I bought the Fx9 to complement my A7 III and why I didn't switch to a different manufacturer or just wait till the A7S Mark III comes out. So this obviously isn't about whether the Fx9 is better than the A7 III. Obviously the quality is going to be better and it does a lot of things better than the A7 III, but it's just more about my specific use case and if you kind of identify with that. So the first big thing is the quality. So let's start out with the number of Ks. No, this is not like the R5 or C500 Mark II. It doesn't shoot 6K, it doesn't shoot 8K. It's actually very similar in terms of the Ks to the A7 III. It downsamples a 6K signal down into 4K. Now, I think the Fx9 does a little bit of a different process, and obviously it has a more robust codec. It has the A7iii codec, which is 240 megabits per second at 24 frames per second. 10-bit color, so it's much more robust than anything Sony mirrorless has to offer. I really like this codec because it makes me feel like I don't need something like a RAW codec. It still fits in my workflow. The file sizes are pretty manageable and I get really good color latitude and I'm really happy with it so far. That being said, I would really appreciate it if Sony added in the x-AVC480 codec just to get double that bitrate and have a little bit of a more robust option. But in terms of quality, this is going to be the main thing between the A7 III and the Fx9. The colors are also going to be much better, although it is a bit of an apples to oranges comparison. I shoot everything on the Fx9 in S-Log3, so really I can make it look however I want, and the 10-bit gives it plenty of latitude to have any different look I want to put on it, whereas the A7 III, I get the best results by using a baked-in look. The Fx9 also has the s-cinetone profile, which a lot of people were raving about when it was released. Personally, I haven't used it quite as much because I do like that extra bit of color grading processing that goes into the footage after the fact with the S-Log. But I definitely think that the s-cinetone looks more natural and looks much better than the A7 III straight out of camera. The highlight roll-off looks a lot better, and I think the colors are a little bit more accurate. Then finally, this is one of the biggest things, and that is dynamic range. Sony touts 15 plus stops of dynamic range out of the S-Log3 in this camera, whereas I think that the A7 III is closer to 12 or 13 stops of dynamic range in S-Log3, which I would never touch on the A7 III. So it's not really a big competition. The FX9 does much better in terms of dynamic range and can handle overexposure as well as underexposure much better, and it's definitely more versatile. You can mess up the settings more in the FX9 and bring it back than you could in the A7 III. So this is rather obvious, the quality differences between the FX9 and the A7 III. It's kind of like reading the specs off the box. What I want to do next is do a quick setup and show you guys the differences in the real world in the type of setup I would do. I want to run through a few of the practical conditions that I'd use these two cameras in and compare them. So talk about where the A7 III might be very close to the FX9, and if you do a lot of these situations, you may not need to do the upgrade, but I also want to show you the areas where the FX9 excels over the A7 III and pulls away in a big way. So we've got a pretty typical interview setup here. We've got the 300D on the softbox. We've got the 50 with a Pro Mist filter on that, and one nice thing about the FX9 is you've got great audio inputs. You've got 2 full XLRs plus the MI shoe, so you get 8 audio inputs. You can do multiple sets of levels. So from an audio standpoint, these cameras aren't even close. And it also has a full HDMI, which is great because you keep your face detection autofocus when you plug in an external monitor, which that's a huge factor as well. The colors and the dynamic range are also going to be much better than the A7 III. So I expect the FX9 to look quite a bit better, but the A7 III is still very usable. Okay, so now we've got the A7 III set up in the exact same spot with the exact same lens, so we can see some of the differences between the two. Obviously, the FX9 is working in S-Log3, which is my preferred picture profile, so you have tons of flexibility to add different looks on the FX9 footage. So you get way more control and can be way more creative with it. And if you're doing stuff like internal corporate videos, there may be a bit of a perception thing going on with the A7 III. As much as I don't like to say things like that, and it opens up a lot more jobs that you may not get if you're just shooting with a mirrorless camera. Slow motion is also a really big feature in this camera. It has 4K 60 in Super 35 mode, which isn't mind-blowing, but it is still a very large upgrade over the Sony Alpha series, which still only does slow motion in 1080p. So I touched on it a little bit. One of the huge differences is what I would call a pro video body that the FX9 has versus a mirrorless body like the A7 III. And there are definitely pros and cons. There are a lot of pros to the FX9, XLR inputs, timecode in, SDI out, full HDMI out. You basically get everything that you could ask for in one package, to where if you're working with a crew, they have all of the audio inputs, timecode inputs, and whatever outputs that they could possibly need with this camera. It's also a big part of what makes the camera so versatile. This camera could be used from any type of job, from broadcast television to serious filmmaking. So that's one thing I really like, is it opens up a lot of different job opportunities that I probably wouldn't have with just the A7 III. Now, what the A7 III does have in terms of pros is it's much smaller, it has in-body image stabilization, this camera can fit on a gimbal, and it can quickly switch between the different modes. The FX9 is a bit of a slower camera in terms of stuff like switching to slow motion, whereas with the A7 III I can just simply switch a dial and move it into slow motion mode. The FX9 has to reboot the camera, and it's a much longer process. So as you guys probably know, I've been really wanting to put the FX9 on a gimbal to try that out, and I finally figured out a way to balance it on the Ronin S. You have to completely strip down the FX9 and you have to put it in backwards. This is just a quick sample I did without even touching the settings because I didn't have the monitor attached, and we'll see this a little bit more in the future, I think. So here's the real kind of reasoning that led me to the FX9 coming from the A7 III, and I think the valuable nugget to take from this video. And that is, I think it's just going to be the best financial investment for our business long term. You see, the FS7 was a much longer term camera than something like the A7 III. The FS7 is still widely used 5 years after its release and is still a versatile professional camera that a lot of people are desiring for different jobs, from documentaries to broadcast television to news. I think that camera was a great investment for anyone who bought it back in 2014. So the FX9 is really like an improved FS7 with an FS7 built inside, because you have the ability to crop into Super 35 mode. So I really think that this camera is going to be a great long-term investment. Couple that with the fact that there's a lot of potential for firmware updates down the road. I think Sony is going to add a lot more features into this camera as it gets older. Now, if you're just like a wedding filmmaker, like we have been conducting a lot of our business in the past, I don't know if it's necessarily worth the upgrade, but I'm trying to explore more avenues into commercial videography and documentary style shoots and just bigger productions. And I think the FX9 opens a lot of doors in that department. Not to mention, it's a much more valuable rental than the A7 III. So I want to talk about low light for a minute. The A7 III is a very capable low light camera. It's very good at high ISOs. The main pro from the FX9 in terms of low light is the dual native ISO. So basically, the dual native ISO in combination with the variable ND means I can decide on any setting I want in just about any lighting circumstance. So let's say I'm shooting indoors with available light and I want to shoot at f5.6. Well, I can just flip it into the 4000 base ISO and use the variable ND to dial it in exactly to where the settings line up and I get a good exposure. Now with the A7 III, this is a little more complicated because you have to use ND filters, potentially a variable ND filter. You also are just adding gain into the image every time you bump up that ISO. So I did a quick test with Kristen. We shot at 10,000 ISO, just a little bit of night footage in S-Log. And it's funny, we were actually shooting in the Super 35 mode by accident, and I still think that the images ended up usable. So this camera is very capable and it has the added versatility compared to the A7 III. So what's the conclusion of this video? Am I still interested in the A7S Mark III? What do I think of the EOS R5 that's coming out? Well, I'm still interested in the A7S Mark III. I think the R5 will be an interesting camera, but I really like having the FX9 as my A cam that's versatile for any type of video job, and then having a B cam that can double as a photography camera or a run and gun video camera that can get thrown on a gimbal, etc. So that's kind of where I'm at in terms of these cameras going forward. I'm still anxiously awaiting the A7S Mark III. As you probably know, we're all really excited to see it, and I'll probably be picking one up when it comes out, if it comes out. What I don't want to end up doing is just chasing whatever the hype camera is at any given moment, whether it's a Blackmagic Pocket 6K, Canon EOS R5, whatever Nikon's doing, whatever Panasonic's doing. I just want to stick with the camera that works for me, and so far Sony cameras have been the most versatile options for me. So that's kind of my thoughts on Sony cameras, the E-mount, the A7 III, and the FX9.